In this video, I will be showing how to install FILMIFY and how it works. So first of all, when you download it from the marketplace and add it to your project, you will first need to go to plugins, and you will need to enable JSON Blueprint Utilities. So check that and restart the editor. Otherwise, FILMIFY will not compile and it won't work. So once you've done that, you can come back, and if you open up example number 4, you will open up this scene, and I've removed FILMIFY from it real quick, so I'll add it back in, and you can immediately see the effect. So FILMIFY works exactly like a traditional post-processing volume. When you drop it in your scene, you have the classic unbound, enabled, all that default post-process volume settings. Unbound is enabled by default because I use unbound almost every time. So FILMIFY has quite some parameters, which I will go over one by one now. First of all, we have halation, for example, which is, if I turn this on and off, it's the subtle like red glow around the hotspots of your image. This is something that happens in film, and it's what gives film its characteristics very often. There's presets for different settings that I've made, so it'll ask you if you want to actually load a preset before you do so, because otherwise you might lose your settings. But if you double click it, you will see some presets that I have made. But I want to go back to the default ones, so actually I can in here say default settings and load it. And do I really want to load it? Yes, load confirm. This is another preset that I've saved as JSON, which is basically just the default settings of FILMIFY. If we continue down, there are some settings for global project settings like project frame rate, which if you're used to seeing cinematic frame rates like 25, you can do that in your project and it'll mimic that cinematic look a little bit better if you're developing. We have settings for grain, obviously, so you can turn it on. All the parameters you can switch on and off. Grain has like grain intensity, which if I put it to 0, there's no grain. If I put it up, it's very intense. There's grain color. So this is a bit confusing, but the grain itself has color, and the grain intensity, if you put it all the way up, then it'll actually have no color. But if you put grain intensity down, it blends with the original image. So got to be aware of that when you're doing any color work. I'll reset those. There's settings for grain size. I put no limit to how big you want the grain size to be, just for artistic purposes. I don't want to limit those. I did limit the grain size going smaller than 0 because it doesn't look any different. Luma multiply is something that is for the grain plates, so if you want the grain to show up more in dark spots, then you can do this, or if you want it to show up more in the highlights, then you can decrease it and see it more in hotspots, because otherwise it just gets clipped. And there's some textures for grain plates that have a very subtle difference. Another setting is dirt. If you enable it, you can see these white, dirty spots. I can make this subtractive as well if you want them to be dark. There's scale settings for them. There's color settings for them. The color setting works better for non-subtractive dirt because then you can actually give it a color. It's kind of green now. It's hard to see. I'll keep that whitish. This dirt amount, so it can make it more subtle or less subtle. If I turn that off, we can go down to dust, which is basically the same, but it's just an extra layer of dirt. So you can have this one be white or black as well. But the reason that there's two is that a lot of the times there's so much dirt, and some of them are kind of additive and some of them are not. Let me actually try to make this look good. Okay, like this. So you can see dark spots and brighter white spots all over your image, just to make it more dirty. I'll turn those off for now. We have bloom settings. These settings are, again, just default post-process bloom exposed in FILMIFY, because their bloom effect is very good already, so there's no need to remake that. Gate weave is a setting for usually a little bit older movies. You can see that the gate weave, if I turn it up, you can see the effect really clearly. This is something that happens with older movies a little bit more, because, well, the whole reason is explained in my documentation, so I'm not going to go into it here, but this is an effect that you see in film. And if you turn it down, it's much more subtle, but it gives that little like texture to your scene. And if you turn it up all the way down to 0, it's off, obviously. I'll leave it on because I think it looks nice. Vignette is on by default. This is basically exactly like the vignette you're used to, but a little bit more customized, because sometimes older movies, they have a very tight vignette like this, and it kind of grows in. It's actually fully opaque. So an older movie, sometimes it'll transition and it'll go all the way in. And you can't do that with the normal vignette in Unreal, so I exposed that option here. Splotches, for lack of a better term, it's more of a brightness variation in your image. So what does that mean? It means if I turn this up all the way, you can see very clearly that there's some noise pattern. Changing the brightness, if you make this smaller, you can see very clearly it's just noise. It works better at higher scales and maybe a little bit more subtle intensities. This is also an effect mostly in old film. It's due to bad restoration of film, or just very old and dirty rolls of film, but it also gives your scene this nice texture. If we go down, there's an option for film border. This is a very stylized effect. It's not super true to real life, but yeah, it's just nice. There's more options for borders, so if I take border 16:9, because right now my aspect ratio is that, you can see it just has these nice beveled corners. There's also one for square, which obviously will not work with my aspect ratio because it's not square. So just be aware of that you choose the right aspect ratio. Then if we go down, this is one of my favorite options. There's a little checkbox for old film coloring. Films before color film was invented, they would sometimes dye them in paint or in some ink. And so it immediately just cuts out all the color, and you can set this color to be like the tint that you want. And not every color gives the same feeling of, I guess, 1920s nostalgia. But the default here is one that I got from Dr. Caligari, which is a movie that uses tinting a lot. If I turn this off, there's one more option down here. I'm sorry for the order. There's still a bug in Unreal Engine that has been there for forever. I've tried to sort these parameters in a nice way, but it will simply not allow me. So it's a little bit random. Anyway, the last feature is color grading. These are just some basic color grading settings for temperature or tint. So this is green or magenta. This is more bluish or more orange. Saturation, contrast. Nice. And exposure. So these are all post-effect exposures on top of FILMIFY at the end of the chain. These can help you dial in your colors a little bit. If you don't want to use those, you can still add a post-process volume, another one, the default. And FILMIFY works in conjunction with this. So if I go to the color grading settings for the normal, here we go, normal post-process effect, then in here you can see it doesn't work. Right, so don't forget to set infinite extend, because otherwise it'll not do anything. Okay, so now if I go to the color grading settings, you can see saturation, exposure, all of these still work. So if you have a normal workflow that includes all these color grading settings, then FILMIFY doesn't break that workflow because it works together with normal post-process volumes. I'll delete it for now. The last thing that I want to go over is FILMIFY presets, but also custom presets. So say for instance, I am in play mode, and in version 1 of FILMIFY, your settings will not be saved if you change them in play mode and you exit them. They will revert back to when you started play mode. A way to get around this is to save your custom preset. But this also works if you're not in play mode. This is just like an example how you could use it. So if I now change this to something ridiculous, I'll just make the changes very obvious. So grain size is crazy. Actually, there's it's going to be this color. So if I want to go, all right, this is my settings. If you hit save preset, it'll say preset my settings saved. This is, by the way, only if you have show stats enabled. Otherwise, that message won't show up. Now, all your settings have been saved to a JSON in a folder next to FILMIFY. So if I now exit play mode, it's going to revert back to the original, except if I fill in the name of the preset that I want, I'm going to go load custom preset. Oh, it's going to give me a warning. Click again to confirm, just so you don't accidentally load something that you didn't want. So if I click it again, it's going to actually load my preset. And this is a very nice way to save settings and switch between them if you want. These FILMIFY presets work the exact same way. They're just pre-made. And that is kind of it. That is FILMIFY.